There aren't many games that can make me feel uncomfortable without really doing much, but Observation manages it pretty effectively. It's not really a horror game per se, more a puzzle adventure game wrapped in a claustrophobic space thriller atmosphere, and its most unique selling point is that players don't control any of the game's human elements. Instead, you take the role of a space station AI after the station in question mysteriously finds its way halfway across the solar system, with the majority of its crew missing in action. And this initial mystery is probably where Observation is strongest, though I'd be lying if I said its narrative held up well under greater scrutiny. It's cool to not know why your mission has been sabotaged, and not knowing if your missing crew or even yourself are responsible, and finding answers along the way is satisfying, but I felt like I left with way more questions than I had when I started. Still, while I was playing it, I found the core narrative to be creepy and engrossing in all the right ways, and the setting is established really well with little computer logs and notes that you can find throughout the game. These little clues and story tidbits make exploring the station beyond the bare minimum fairly rewarding, and the way the environment becomes more dark, disorderly, and straight up broken matches the tone of the narrative well as you progress. Seeing the environment through the various lenses of the station AI, known as Sam, also gives it an interesting look, complete with these video quality filters and fun technical glitches to really sell the damage that the station has sustained. The game's visuals aren't perfect though. There was this weird thing that would happen from time to time whenever the game swapped between gameplay and cutscene, where you'd still be looking through the same viewpoint, but all the filters would disappear for no apparent reason. It was super jarring. I also found the human character models were a bit off-putting. You don't see a whole bunch of humans during the game's runtime, but whenever you do see a person's face, it looks fine, I guess. Except for the eyes. They fall a bit too far into the uncanny valley, but it almost works in the game's favor by upping that creepy factor, you know? Still weird, might work. Hard to say. All of the game's voice acting is pretty solid though, and despite not meeting many humans face to face, you're bound to hear plenty of audio logs throughout your exploration. The game's ambient soundtrack is similarly pretty solid, making for an increasingly more oppressive atmosphere as things get more and more out of hand. The game itself is a pretty straightforward puzzle-adventure game. Your companion for the majority of the story will generally give you objectives such as opening broken hatches or operating generator systems, and this is usually accomplished by swapping between static camera views and solving one of a handful of puzzle types. The puzzles in question are generally pretty straightforward, usually presented to you alongside some basic instructions on how each one in particular works. You're very rarely left in the dark, and for the few occasions that you are, the puzzles are never so overwhelming that you'll be stuck forever. However, there are some elements in Observation that are a bit more frustrating, such as actually finding clues or puzzles to interact with within the environment. Scanning each available camera angle for stuff that you can interact with is usually pretty interesting, but sometimes it feels a bit pixel hunty. This aspect is at its worst when you find yourself outside the space station with full 3D control over your camera, and little to no direction about where you need to be heading. In fact, I think the most annoying parts of Observation are whenever you're forced into the floating camera probe, as opposed to the fixed cameras in the station. For one, the actual control of the probe itself isn't super responsive, and the lack of vertical control without pointing your camera in that direction first is mildly frustrating. On top of all that, figuring out exactly where you are and where you need to go in 3D space can be difficult, especially as the environment becomes darker and more difficult to differentiate as you progress. When you're swapping between static cameras, this isn't really an issue, as you have a map that makes jumping between locations an absolute breeze, even from one end of the station to the other. In probe mode, it can take a while to get your bearings, unless you use the waypoint map function, which the game never explains or points out, which is super handy. I suppose the unique movement options on offer play into that oppressive, restrictive feeling that the game's atmosphere is hammering home, but the floaty probe movement just feels kinda silly. Now, I think the coolest thing that Observation features is its dialogue system, but it implies a bit more branching than I think is actually possible. As an AI, you're able to respond to characters by highlighting relevant environmental or systemic items, and in theory you can lie to characters or give them incorrect information, but none of it actually seems to matter. It's nifty as you experience the opening hour or two, but feels less novel as you go forward. In turn, this means that there just doesn't feel like a lot of reason to come back and replay Observation, beyond a handful of collectibles that you're bound to miss, and the story itself won't last much longer than 4 or 5 hours, depending on how much better your brain handles 3D space than mine does. With that, Observation is good. It's pretty straightforward. Observation brings a solid narrative to the table and wraps it up in a neat gimmick in the form of its AI character and how you navigate most of the environment. The puzzles are solid for the most part, and the atmosphere and voice acting really sell the creepy mystery of the game. There are some minor frustrations to be had, but overall I think it's worth checking out if you're a fan of lonely feeling space thrillers.